Hi, welcome back. We are now in stage 4. We have advanced considerably in the design thinking process and we looked at the problem statement, we converted it into an opportunity statement, then we detailed out the ideas, we shortlisted the quick wins based on what we felt was right, then we called in the champions, the internal customers, we spoke to the external customers, validated the quick wins, added a few more quick wins, refined the ideas, and now we are at the stage of prototyping. And like I kept insisting right from the beginning, prototyping is a key element of design thinking. Now, prototyping in design thinking does not necessarily mean that you're building a physical prototype. Let me talk about an organization that I was dealing with where we were running a design thinking project. They were looking at how they could maximize the utilization of their warehouse. Now, does it involve a human element? Of course, it involves a human element because people get used to a specific behavior which becomes their habit and they don't think beyond it. Now, when they got into design thinking and when they practiced all that, then ultimately the ideas had to be packed together in terms of how they were going to reconfigure the warehouse, right? So, what did they do? They required a tool. They required a tool because a prototype is normally in your head, it's in your mind, it's in your heart, and people can't read your thoughts, people can't read your mind. Therefore, it has to be brought out in terms of a sketch or some tool by which people can comprehend what the prototype looks like. So, not only are you creating a prototype, but you're also actioning the prototype at the stage 4 because what's the point of keeping a prototype on the drawing paper? Now, the prototype, interestingly, is an innovation. And if it's an innovation, what is it expected to do? It is expected to improve certain things the way you do them. It is expected that it improves upon the quality of the work or the process or the system where you're incorporating the prototype. Or it will also necessitate that it has to take care of the safety norms. It also has to ensure that it de-risks a lot of propositions that you are into because what's the point in creating a prototype that creates a additional risk for you? And it has to augment your profits, right? And that's the way the prototypes work. So you bring the quick wins, which are validated, the ones that are assessed, and now you pack them in a tool so that they come into a tangible form. And when they become into a tangible form, then you, your champions, your internal stakeholders, probably your external stakeholders, you sit down together and then you derive how will you actually measure the success of this prototype. Now, if that measurement is okay and your prototype lives up to those expectations, fine. But if the prototype is not living up to those expectations, then you might want to build in certain more ideas which you have kept at the back burner or the list of the ideas that you've created and ensure that you refine the prototype so that it comes to the measurable outcomes that you have desired. Now, prototypes have to be controlled through measurable outcomes because if those outcomes are not happening, that means your prototype is not fine, it's not working. In my scenarios, I have noticed every time I have taken follow up sessions in design thinking, I realize that the first cut prototype is always an incomplete one. When they go and implement it, inevitably they realize that it's not working. And that's the beauty of design thinking. Design thinking agrees on the fact that you fail early, you fail fast, so that you're able to bring in the remedy. But the remedy is a critical component of the prototype. In design thinking, the whole principle is that your prototype should never fail, and therefore you persistently keep adding value to the prototype by building in ideas that you have built in during the earlier stages. So prototype is getting ideas and explorations out of your head into the physical world, inform some tangibility. Like we said, design thinking professionals in the premier institutes create clay models. Why do they create a clay model? Because the model is at the back of their mind. If they created a car, it's at the back of their mind, but the clay model gives them the tangibility. Prototype can be anything that takes a physical or a digital form. Even digital prototypes are fine. It can become a bottleneck between dream and a reality, but often simple prototype is the most effective thing. And therefore, in design thinking, we always say do not build complex prototypes. Build a prototype that can be executed in 45 days clear. So, what are the key learning? We bring all the quick wins together, which are validated by the champions, by the stakeholders. We determine the measurables as to what will decide that the prototype is successful. If required, you pack in some more ideas, go back and implement. You will experience a failure most of the time. Come back, incorporate the ideas so that now the prototype is assessed, refined, and good to go. What decides that the prototype is good? We discussed this in the earlier sessions of ours. The first thing that you're looking at when you're talking about building of the prototype, that the ideas and the capability of incorporating the ideas have to exist within the organization. That means the capability of execution has to exist within the organization. The second thing we look at is defensibility. The prototype must add value to the stakeholders whose noise you're wanting to eliminate. The third thing about a prototype is that it has to be scalable. That means you should be able to build on add-ons onto your prototype so that the prototype grows over a period of time. You don't abandon the prototype because that effort goes waste. And finally, it has to add value. That means it should bring in dollars, it should bring in euros, it should bring in rupees. When we work with design thinking projects in organizations and when we actually validate the outcome of the projects, there have been savings which are in a few millions of dollars which have got created. In certain organizations, they brought about a productive transformation in the process itself. They brought about a productive transformation in the supply chain itself. They brought about a productive transformation in the way the teams collaborated. They created a new process. They created a new business model. So, design thinking prototypes have no end to themselves. Now, let's look at certain design thinking tools that you could use to build a prototype. My favorite is mind map. It's so beautiful that it structures everything in form of primary threads, which are your primary ideas, and the secondary and the tertiary threads, which will support your primary ideas. You can have multiple primary ideas, but I'll restrict them to 7 threads, which are primarily. So in the center, you have the opportunity statement. It could be a circle, it could be an amoeboid structure. And from that circle or the amoeboid structure, you pull out the threads, and those threads typically are the primary threads, which are the key concepts that you want to implement in the prototype. And then you have the secondary and the tertiary components of the prototype, which put together create the entire phase of the prototype all put together. So mind maps are used to generate, visualize, structure, and classify ideas, to look for patterns and insights that provide key design criteria. This is a tangibility that comes into a prototype. If there is no mind map tool, then it just resides in your head. That's it. It doesn't go beyond that. Now, this is done by displaying the data and asking people to cluster them in the ways that allow the themes and patterns to emerge clearly. That means what are you doing? You're bringing this entire mind map together. It's a diagrammatic representation, and the diagrammatic representation in form of the threads creates the primary thread, secondary thread, tertiary thread, and that thread actually builds a prototype that people can visualize. Now, when you build this entire mind map, for each of the threads, you can actually determine the measurements associated with it. And when the measurements associated with it are determined, then what you can do is that this measurement then defines how the prototype or the mind mapping tool is going to be measured in terms of its performance. You can also look at certain visualization tools to build your prototype. Now, what are the visualization tools that you can build as a prototype? The visualization tools can be sketches, they can be intricate, detailed out diagrams, it could be anything. For instance, if we go back to the warehousing thing, I remember those folks actually created a diagram of the bays, how they would stack, how the face looks like, how the sorting of the material would happen. All that they looked at, and this is where the design thinking tool actually helped them to visualize. So we talked about a whole lot of tools in the beginning when we were talking about prototyping. We talked about high fidelity, low fidelity prototypes. You decide how you're going to do it, but phase one of prototype building is normally a low fidelity prototype, and that low fidelity prototype ultimately moves into a high fidelity prototype. And that high fidelity prototype, which is a detailed version of what the prototype looks like, gets actioned ultimately. That's what design thinking is all about when it comes to prototyping. Thank you very much. You've been through the entire process of prototyping with me now. And now we go to the stage where you're going to implement the prototype, you're going to action the prototype, and you're going to scale up the prototype. Thank you for your persistence. We are at the end stages now of the design thinking process. Go ahead, start practicing design thinking, and remember, design thinking process is a collaborative process. It cannot be done alone ever. You have to co-create the design thinking process. You can never operate in isolation because diversity of thoughts and diversity of processes is extremely critical. What did we learn in this entire process? We learned that we bring the quick wins and the validated ideas and we convert them into a prototype. That is a low fidelity prototype. We go back, we refine it, that becomes a high fidelity prototype, or it becomes a dynamic prototype for all you know. You can convert that prototype into a mind map. Mind map gives you a visual display of how all the ideas are packing together in form of primary threads, secondary threads, and tertiary threads. Or you can create a visual of that, which is a digital visual of that, and then you can also make a dynamic thing so that what happens is that people can actually see it. So visualization can be pictures, visualization can be digital, it can be anything, right? So you create a visual of that, and then you go ahead and get ready to action it off and to test whether your prototype is actually working, and that becomes a part of the learning lunch. That's how it is. Let's move to the next part, and that's where your design thinking process starts moving into its finality. Thank you very much. See you in the next video.